So good afternoon, and welcome to the Herbert Hoover Presidential Library Museum on this rainy Labor Day. I'm Tom Schwartz, the director, and we're delighted that Caroline Fraser, author of the award-winning book Prairie Fires, The American Dreams of Laura Ingalls Wilder, is here to talk about her book. This program, like most, is made possible by the support from the Hoover Presidential Foundation. This foundation is the main support organization for the programs, events, and exhibits at the Library and Museum. As many of you know, we are one of two presidential libraries that contain collections of famous literary figures. The Kennedy Library in Boston holds the papers of Ernest Hemingway. We hold the papers of Rose Wilder Lane, daughter of Laura Ingalls Wilder, that also contain correspondence between daughter and mother, as well as drafts of Laura Ingalls Wilder and her writings. Every Labor Day, we remember Laura Ingalls Wilder and her writings by having speakers who can provide new insights into the creator of the Little House books, and their enduring cultural legacy. Today is no exception. Caroline Fraser has spent a lifetime as an editor and writer. Born in Seattle, she holds the PhD in English and American Literature from Harvard University. She worked at The New Yorker as part of the editorial staff, author of Rewilding the World, Dispatches from the Conservation Revolution, and God's Perfect Child, Living and Dying in the Christian Science Church. Fraser has become a celebrated writer in her own right. As editor of the Little House books for the Library of America edition, she became intrigued with the larger lives of Laura Ingalls Wilder and Rose Wilder Lane, resulting in Prairie Fires. This dual biography has been awarded the National Book Critics Circle Award in Biography, the Pulitzer Prize in Biography, and the Plutarch Award. For those of you who aren't up on your classics, Plutarch was a Greek who wrote about the lives of notable Greek and Romans, and he kind of paired them off, one Greek, one Roman, to teach the virtues that people should cultivate. It's referenced more than read, like most classics, and if you get a copy and you find you don't like it, at least it provides a handy doorstop. She's also written numerous articles that have appeared in The New Yorker, the New York Review of Books, the Atlantic Monthly, and many other publications. We are indeed honored to have such a distinguished writer and author with us today. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Caroline Fraser.
Thank you so much, and thanks for your patience this afternoon and for coming out on Labor Day. And many thanks to Tom Schwartz for that wonderful introduction and arranging my visit here today. It's a real honor to be here. I have a lot of gratitude and respect for the Herbert Hoover as an institution. My book would not have been possible without it.
Be louder.
Is this a little bit better?
Yeah.
Okay, I'll try and keep it closer. And it's wonderful to have a chance to thank some of the staff who've helped me over the years. I just wanted to mention Dwight Miller, who's now retired, but was of course responsible for acquiring the Rose Wilder Lane papers. I first got in touch with him in 1994 when I was working on a review of William Holtz's biography of Lane, and over the years he's been very generous in answering questions both in person and on the phone about his recollections of that whole process. And I also wanted to just thank quickly Spencer Howard, the indefatigable archivist who has helped me with so much, and Matt Schaefer, Lynn Smith, and Jim Detlefson. Craig Wright has been also quite wonderful, helping me with scans of documents and responding to frantic last-minute requests for images. So very grateful for all the professionalism and patience over the years. I'm here to talk about Prairie Fires, my biography, and the subtitle of the book is The American Dreams of Laura Ingalls Wilder. And I think that Wilder and the Little House books have really influenced how we think about a whole host of issues that might be classified as our American dreams. Just a show of hands, anybody who's read any of the Little House books or seen the TV show, let me just see how many people have a connection. It just never fails. I mean, they are just, universally beloved. And it's fascinating to see because it's that very popularity of the Little House universe that's kind of essential to what I wanted to talk about today. I wanted to start by talking about something called national biography. Emerson, in his famous essay on self-reliance, wrote, "All history resolves itself very easily into the biography of a few stout and earnest persons." And Prairie Fires is about one of those stout and earnest persons. And given where we are in an institution devoted to a major national figure, I wanted to talk a little bit about how American identity has been influenced over time by the phenomenon of national biography. And by that, I mean not actual biographies, not books, but tales, often tall, that are told about national figures. We have this tendency as Americans to define and reinvent ourselves by telling biographical stories. We tell stories about the founding fathers, about our folk heroes. A lot of these, began as legends or have passed into legend. You've got George Washington chopping down the cherry tree, Daniel Boone in his coonskin cap. But if you read a biography, a real one, of Boone, there's an excellent one by Robert Morgan. He said, "Forget the coonskin cap, he never wore one." But that just shows how common these tropes become. Most of us don't know the difference anymore between like Daniel Boone and Davy Crockett, the king of the wild frontier, if any of you are familiar with that old TV show. And by now they've kind of become so mixed up in our minds that we can barely tell the difference. And I think folk heroes particularly become so beloved that they're almost generic, almost meaningless after a while. And this is a process that has happened or has begun to happen with Laura Ingalls Wilder. In some ways, she's almost been loved to death because of the popularity of the books and especially the TV show. So the idea behind Prairie Fires was to kind of cut against the myth-making, to correct that simplification and separate the mythology of her life, some of it self-created, from the reality. And Prairie Fires is also an attempt to address the fact that our founding fathers and folk heroes were men, largely. Presidents, military heroes, business figures, frontier types like Boone and Crockett and the young Abe Lincoln. In terms of the frontier, these guys were also solitary men, not family men. The backwoodsman, the hunter, the guy with the gun. But over the past few decades, there's been a shift in the way we think about the log cabin era. Because right now, for good or ill, the iconographic figure who represents that time is not Daniel Boone or Davy Crockett, it's Laura Ingalls Wilder. Although her reputation, too, is evolving. But she's become an American icon. As a person and as a fictional character, she represents the frontier era, but she's a real contrast to those earlier figures. She's a woman, and she's not solitary. She's all about family and domesticity and farming. And yet she, too, promotes that core American value of self-reliance through the self-supporting farm, something that was one of the original American dreams, having your own land and being able to support your family on it. And one of the remarkable things about her, I think, is that she recognized in herself her capacity to do this, to represent an era. We know this because midway through writing her books in the late 1930s, she gave a speech in Detroit at a book fair. The original is in this library. And I just want to read a couple lines from it. She said, "I realized I had seen and lived it all the successive phases of the frontier. First the frontiersman, then the pioneer, then the farmers and the towns. I understood that in my own life I represented a whole period of American history." And she did. She lived from 1867, just after the end of the Civil War, to 1957, which was the Eisenhower administration. So a very long, but not just long, an eventful life. And what I wanted to do in Prairie Fires was to show that she was a real person, a complicated and contradictory person, somebody who was both a witness and participant, an interpreter of everything from the Plains Indian Wars to the Dust Bowl and the New Deal and the Great Depression. And all of these things influence her work. They are the backdrop of her work. Of course, most people came to know Wilder's life through her books. Most readers, and certainly I did as a child, assumed that the stories she told were true or autobiographical because the books, after all, are about Laura Ingalls, and they're by Laura Ingalls Wilder. And yet her books are not autobiography. They're fiction. And Wilder and her secret editor, who was her daughter, the journalist, Rose Wilder Lane, shaped the stories in ways that continue to really influence our understanding of who white settlers were and what they were doing on the land. One of the scholars who's written about national biography, this myth-making tendency, has said that our identity is based on a denial of history. And I think that phrase has a particular resonance for what Wilder is doing in her books. Much of the way she shapes her life story involves leaving things out. Of course, they were written for children, so perfect reason to leave things out. But she also, I think, clearly felt an emotional need to do so. She wanted to portray her parents in the best possible light, to show that they'd reached a place of stability and security. And in fact, they never really did. So by leaving things out of her stories, Wilder, in effect, was contributing to our national biography, shaping our sense of who we are and where we came from. And you can see how she did this in her most important book, Little House on the Prairie. That book is about the Ingalls family, pioneering in Kansas, or what she called Indian Territory. But by extension, it's about the westward expansion, her presentation of that, and of white settlers' encounter with Indians has become central and very controversial in how kids have absorbed their understanding of it. We've seen the controversy in the past few months because the American Library Association has removed Wilder's name from an award because of the book's racial stereotypes. So I thought we'd talk a little bit about that book because the stereotypes themselves are part of our national biography. The whole concept of manifest destiny is based on an explicitly racial doctrine, that it was providence that the sons of Puritan immigrants should explore and settle the West. So at the beginning of Little House on the Prairie, Wilder establishes what I think of as a kind of tabula rasa, a blank slate, which is similar to like negative space in drawing or painting. If you've ever taken an art class, they always tell you that the negative space, the kind of air around the face or the figure or the bowl of fruit, is just as powerful in shaping the composition as the work itself. What's not there is as important as what is. And this is true of Little House on the Prairie. Wilder makes it sound as if the Ingalls are completely alone at this place and time, almost like no one has been there before. It's kind of like an American Eden. She famously wrote about the prairie, "There were no people." She's providing no history, no context, no background. She never mentions, for example, that her father was a squatter. He didn't own his land. Part of a very controversial movement of outsiders coming and settling on land that belonged to the Indians, trying to force the government to redistribute it. Now, she knew he was a squatter. She said so, used that very word in a letter to her daughter. But instead of talking about that, she shows her father simply arriving, choosing a piece of land, building a little house. And likewise, her portrayal of the Osage Indians begins as a kind of tabula rasa, leaving out any specific history of their situation. So the reader's in the same situation as Laura in the book, feeling the same curiosity and fear. In the novel, almost as soon as they arrive, little Laura, the fictional character, starts nagging her mother about when they're going to see Indians. She wants to see a papoose. Her mother is not thrilled with this. Ma tells Laura that she doesn't like Indians, and when Laura asks, "Why don't you like Indians, Ma?" Ma doesn't really have an answer. Laura says, quite reasonably, "What did we come to their country for if you don't like them?" We later learn that Ma is afraid of Indians because of a mysterious event called the Minnesota Massacre. Wilder never explains what that is, possibly because she didn't need to. It was quite famous at the time. Was, of course, a reference to the U.S. Dakota War of 1862, when 600 white settlers were killed in a surprise attack by the Dakota, who went to war over treaty violations. There's an account of this at the beginning of Prairie Fires, because I'm not about leaving things out. So that's another way in which she accomplishes this tabula rasa. She just doesn't explain certain things. But it's a complex technique, because in the end, I think it makes us think about what it is that we don't know. And Laura's questions keep coming up. She poses them again to her father later. Ma is singing a song called The Blue Juniata about an Indian maiden, which is one of those things popular in the 19th century with a very romantic, stereotypical view of Indians. And settlers love all these songs and legends and melancholy myths, and yet they're terrified of these people. And that fear becomes the justification for treaty violations and land grabs, including the Ingalls' own. So after her mother sings the song, Laura brings up her questions again to her father, asking, why is the government making the Indians leave? And Pa says, I'm going to just read you a little bit, when white settlers come into a country, the Indians have to move on. The government is going to move these Indians further west any time now. That's why we're here, Laura. White people are going to settle all this country, and we get the best land because we get here first and take our pick. Now do you understand? And Laura says, yes, Pa. But then she persists and says, but Pa, I thought this was Indian territory. Won't it make the Indians mad to have to move on? And Pa says, no more questions, Laura. Go to sleep. So the question never gets resolved, but Wilder has raised it, so it's in our minds. And instead of answering it, we get this extraordinary scene toward the end. I think it's really one of the most remarkable scenes in all of these books and in much of American literature about this period. Laura is sitting on the stoop of the little house on the prairie and watching as this long line of Osage Indians are riding their ponies away from their land, moving to government land. And she looks in the beautiful, bright black eyes of an Indian baby. This is one of these papooses she has been yearning to see. And she cries out, "Pa, get me that Indian baby." And when he refuses, she's inconsolable. She cries, she whines, she wants that Indian baby. And this was her actual memory. She wrote in the manuscript in a note to her daughter, "I've never wanted anything as badly since." And that is a breathtaking image of what the entire novel is about. The appropriation of everything that belonged to the Indians. Not just their land, but the lumber to build the little house, the beads that the children wear around their necks. The settlers want to be free to take anything they want without having to pay a price, and they want the government to let them do it. So consciously or not, she has crafted this out of memory and negative space. And taken together, this leaves us, as great works of literature often do, with a sense of ambiguity. You read Little House on the Prairie one way, and it appears to be a defense of manifest destiny, complete with the notorious slur, "The only good Indian is a dead Indian." Read it another way, and it appears to question, through Laura, through the mouths of babes, that doctrine. One thing, however, is not ambiguous here, and that is the portrayal of the federal government, which plays the role of a kind of deus ex machina, forcing the family to leave. At the end, Pa discovers that the government is planning to move white people out of Indian territory. He gets very angry and he says, "Gosh darn it, we're going to leave before they force us off." And boom, they're gone. The novel actually ends very abruptly when the family walks away and leaves their little house standing alone on the prairie. And if Pa emerges as the hero, then the government is the villain. And this raises more questions, but if we talk about the context in which these books were written, we can start to see some answers. Little House on the Prairie was published in 1935, at a time when Wilder herself was deeply disgusted with the government, and she was hardly alone. Her daughter, Rose Wilder Lane, had become vehemently opposed to Roosevelt and the New Deal, and her mother shared those views. And this moment in Little House on the Prairie is one of the first signs of that. So this brings us to Laura and Rose, this very unusual mother-daughter, writer-editor team. There really isn't much else like it in the history of literature. A lot of people ask me, what did you learn when you were writing this book that surprised you? And I'll tell you, what surprised me the most was Rose. I mean, I knew about her from William Holtz's biography, but I was constantly astonished at the force of her personality, at her behavior, and how strongly she influenced the shaping of the Little House books and that denial of history. Rose, of course, had a tumultuous childhood, and almost from the moment she became an adult, she would be central to her mother's writing career. After she graduated from high school, she became a telegrapher, went to San Francisco, got married, and eventually wound up back in that city in 1915, working at the Bulletin, a newspaper that was heavily influenced by yellow journalism. Most of the city papers then were, because of William Randolph Hearst, who got his start in San Francisco. Her editor at the Bulletin was a close friend of Hearst's, Fremont Older. Older was with Hearst on his honeymoon. His wife Cora would eventually write the official biography of Hearst. And with Fremont Older as her mentor, Rose almost immediately became a prolific celebrity biographer, although she had little experience in journalism. Which of course brings us back to that whole issue of national biography, the myth-making, because many of Lane's earliest works were part of that tendency to mythologize our great figures. She wrote these very dubious biographies of Henry Ford, Jack London, and of course Herbert Hoover. That's how the papers ended up here. All of them fictionalized because Rose was just steeped in yellow journalism. And since we're here, I thought I would just mention a few words about her treatment of Hoover, which is interesting in light of her mother's work. Lane had gotten into big trouble right off the bat, writing a kind of a fake autobiography of Charlie Chaplin. So by the time she got to Hoover, she was trying to be a little more circumspect. But she just, I think, couldn't help herself, in terms of fictionalizing. She would do interviews and research. She talked to one of Hoover's brothers, for example. But when she sat down to write, all that just went out the window. And the biography is full of kind of invented scenes and dialogue. She sort of novelized everything. And the Hoover biography is no exception. And she hints at this in her preface. She wrote, "The method used in handling this biographical material is so unusual that a word of explanation is necessary. The facts on which the story is based I do not believe to be open to dispute. Every detail has been collected with meticulous care from sources of unquestionable authority. The interpretation of them is my own." There you go. So she knew she was skating on thin ice, and this would be her last such biography. But it's interesting to compare her treatment of Hoover's childhood and Ford's with the manuscript of Farmer Boy, because there's some real overlap there. So from a literary standpoint, Lane's celebrity journalism is really important. Because in 1915, as Rose is getting off the ground as a celebrity biographer, her mother comes to visit her in San Francisco. Laura wants to see Rose and the World's Fair, but she also wants to apprentice herself to her daughter in the writing trade. And Laura, as it turned out, had no problem with what Rose was doing. And what would the two of them end up working on years later? Another kind of fictionalized autobiography. So you can see the origins of the Little House books in Rose's earliest career. Rose always saw the commercial potential of her mother's life, and the genre of the Little House books evolved out of that exposure to yellow journalism. From the beginning, Rose urged her mother to work on what they called the story of your life thing. And Laura did begin writing about her family, first in the Missouri Ruralist, a regional paper in the 1910s and 20s. After she quit doing that, she started writing a memoir, Pioneer Girl. When that didn't sell, Wilder used that material as an outline and a basis for her children's novels. And she embarks on these novels during one of the worst periods in American history, during the Dust Bowl and the Depression. And her response to that is not to recreate the gritty reality of her childhood. She doesn't do Grapes of Wrath. She instead crafts this very carefully edited version, calibrated for children, and you can see the effects of the editing in the famous grasshopper section in Wilder's fourth book, On the Banks of Plum Creek, where she describes locusts descending on the family farm. These are dark chapters, and her description, as far as it goes, is quite accurate. In fact, historians often cite it as an eyewitness account. But it's very tightly focused on her own family, and she began fictionalizing heavily in describing the consequences. This is where she famously diverges from her own history, editing out the failure. So I thought I'd read a short passage from Prairie Fires so you get a sense not just what happened to Charles Ingalls and his family, but of the larger national crisis. This was 1875. Charles has gone considerably into debt. He's banking on growing a big wheat crop and making a lot of money off that crop, but he's borrowed heavily to build his family a very nice home, probably the nicest home they ever had. Charles was gloating over the wheat as the family sat down to dinner one June day. Raising his arms, he showed them how tall it was, with long, beautiful heads and filling nicely. Just as he pronounced it a wonderful crop, they heard someone calling them outside. It was their neighbor, Alina Nelson, and she was screaming, "The grasshoppers are coming! The grasshoppers are coming!" The Ingalls had no way of knowing it, but the locust swarm descending upon them was the largest in recorded human history. It would become known as Albert's swarm. In Nebraska, a meteorologist named Albert Child measured its flight for 10 days in June, telegraphing for further information from east and west, noting wind speed and carefully calculating the extent of the cloud of insects. He startled himself with his conclusions. The swarm appeared to be 110 miles wide, 1,800 miles long, and a quarter to a half mile in depth. The wind was blowing at 10 miles an hour, but the locusts were moving even faster at 15. They covered 198,000 square miles, Child concluded. "This is utterly incredible," he wrote, "yet how can we put it aside?" The cloud consisted of some 3.5 trillion insects. Swarms swept from Saskatchewan to Texas, devouring everything in their path. The grasshoppers savored the sweat-stained handles of farm implements, chewed the wool off sheep, ate the leaves off trees. After flying, settling, consuming, and laying eggs, they began marching across country, millions massing to form pontoons across creeks and rivers. Hoppers were said to eat everything but the mortgage. When the Ingalls saw the locusts coming, Wilder recalled, her father put on his hat and went out toward his beautiful wheat field. He set fire to berms of straw and manure, hoping to smoke out the locusts, but it was to no avail. By noon of the second day, he gave up and returned to the house exhausted, his eyes all swollen and red from the smoke and lack of sleep. The dream of the perfect crop died that day. It was a nightmarish repetition of Caroline Ingalls' early privation, when she and her siblings had had nothing to eat but breadcrumbs and water. Once again, there was no money to buy food. The catastrophe could not have come at a worse time. Caroline was pregnant again, expecting a child in November. And the consequences to all of this were tragic. You know, the family was impoverished for years. The child that was born then, little Freddie Ingalls, would die less than a year later. None of that made it into the books. They lost their home. They had to go to Iowa, where they were eventually forced to flee their creditors. Yet the wonderful, warm portrait of Charles Ingalls that Wilder crafted in these books continues to make us feel that homesteading and farming, both individually for them and collectively, were by and large a success. So how did she do that, given that these books are in many ways about hardship? Well, she did it not just by leaving things out, but in positive ways, through her happy endings. Every one of these novels ends happily, because she felt that all good novels should. But of course, for most farmers, there was no happy ending. Almost half of American homesteaders washed out, but even those who succeeded on paper, like Almanzo Wilder and Charles Ingalls, did not do well. Odds were stacked against them. Most small farmers and homesteaders were so undercapitalized that they didn't have the money to buy machinery and seed and everything that they would need to tide them over when they lost crops. And these mistakes ended up having real consequences. By the 1890s, a lot of the settlers who came to the plains during the Dakota boom that brought the Ingalls family out to De Smet in Dakota Territory were starving because of drought. And there was a mini dust bowl. This is when the Wilders, Laura and her husband Almanzo, have to flee Dakota Territory and go to Mansfield, Missouri. And this, of course, foreshadows the Dirty 30s, the Dust Bowl, the largest man-made ecological catastrophe in our history, at least so far. Wilder, I think, had no problem showing natural disasters, but she really chose not to dwell on the man-made ones, the bad decisions, the lack of foresight or preparation. She chose to focus on farmers' fulfillment, their satisfaction, their family life. She called her last book These Happy Golden Years, and it's a wonderful book, but nothing could have been further from the truth. Yet both Wilder and her daughter insisted that everything in the books was all true. And Rose, of course, was instrumental in much of this. She is widely believed to have written the famous 4th of July scene in Little Town on the Prairie, which celebrates pulling yourself up by your bootstraps. And it criticizes the federal government in terms that evoke the New Deal. So this is really a moment when the Depression shines right through the fiction. And that, I think, is one of the remarkable things about the Little House books, that Wilder wrote them in the Depression, imagining that her parents were more successful than they were, and that pretense willed into being, almost, her own success. Her life is really one of the most unlikely rags to riches stories in American history. At the beginning of the Depression, she had something like $50 left in the bank. But as she published the books, she started to acquire real wealth. It wasn't, Standard Oil money by any means, but it was, for Mansfield, Missouri, it was money. She used to sing a song called "Don't Leave the Farm, Boys." And it had a line, "There's gold in the farm if only you'll shovel it out." It's appropriate that I'm here on Labor Day to talk about Laura, because I don't think anybody that I've ever heard of worked as hard as she did. But for her, the gold was in books, not crops. She died in 1957, left her estate to her daughter, and Lane's political concerns would shape what happened next. Lane never had children of her own. Toward the end of her life, she became close to the son of her editor at Reader's Digest, a fellow named Roger McBride. He became her literary agent, an attorney, and political acolyte. And when Rose died in 1968, he inherited the estate. And it was McBride who sold the TV rights to a producer in the 1970s. Around that time, he ran for President of the United States as a libertarian in 1976. The television show of Little House on the Prairie would continue the process that Wilder had started, emphasizing the stability of the Ingalls family, making them almost kind of a prosperous frontier dynasty. The producer, Ed Friendly, who had a falling out with the star, Michael Landon, thought the show should be called "How Affluent Was My Prairie?" And the show, of course, was popular with a whole range of people, including Ronald Reagan, who watched it in the White House. And whatever you think of the show, it sort of completed the simplification, the denial of history, making Wilder a folk hero, a legend, blurring the specificity of her life, which is so interesting. The tragedies and the failures that she overcame. The more the TV show aired, the more Michael Landon became a kind of Daniel Boone or Davy Crockett, somebody so generic he was without meaning. So once again, this brings us back to the frontier of national biography and the power it has to simplify our perception of the American dream. There are hazards to that, I think. There are dangers to allowing ourselves to believe our fondest fantasies, to denying or losing sight of our history, the lessons that the Dust Bowl and the Depression have to teach. Those events were the result of our not learning from our mistakes. So I would leave you today with a plea for history, because I think we still have a lot to learn from Wilder's books, but also from her real life and from the rich and important history that is the backdrop of her work. In the end, it's far better to know not only what we wish had happened, but what really happened. So thank you very much.
For a few questions. Okay. She's going to turn up the volume on.
Thank you very much. I really enjoyed your book, and I wondered if you could comment on how the relationship that Laura Ingalls Wilder had with her mother, Caroline, how that informed her relationship with her daughter, Rose.
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I actually opened the book with the day that Laura learned that her mother had died. And her response to that, which was to talk about, how memories are kind of our treasure and our torment. And it's an interesting question because, Rose clearly never had the kind of relationship with her mother that Laura had with her parents. But if you look at when they became parents, there's a real difference there. Caroline Ingalls and Charles were somewhat older when they became parents, and Laura always describes them as being very, even temperament, even-tempered and capable of kind of handling what happened to them, and always making their kids feel safe. I think Laura, who was so much younger, Laura was only 19 when she had Rose, and she had Rose at a time, in the first 4 years of their marriage, were a disaster in almost every possible way, because they suffered all these, they lost all these crops, and they fell ill with diphtheria. Almanzo was left with a disability. And then they lost another child, a boy, and then the house burned down. So, it was just this series of disasters. And I think Laura, perhaps because she was younger, just didn't quite have the even-tempered quality that her own mother had. And as a result, there was a lot of tension between mother and daughter in that relationship.
Thank you, Dr. Fraser, for your really great talk and your really great book. I wonder, what is your opinion as a historian about the American Library Association's decision to take Laura Ingalls Wilder's name off the award? I'm a sociologist, and I struggle with this a little bit too. I love her books, but I do have to admit that they are pretty racially charged in certain areas. At the same time, I worry about what people are going to think about my writings 150 years from now. I mean, it's kind of fair but unfair to make these decisions about the historical stereotypes that people have, and I'm wondering what your opinion is of that.
Sure, yeah. I tend to view this as kind of a narrower issue than I think many people have online. There are a lot of it just the whole thing instantly became kind of part of our political culture wars, and so I think was blown out of proportion in some ways. As somebody who's been working on this topic for a while, and I edited the Library of America's Little House edition, I started hearing about this years ago when that edition came out. Librarians would come up to me and sort of say, under their breath, I had to take the Little House books out of our school library or something like that. And so I think that they've been dealing with this on the ground, in real life for many years. And for the group of librarians, the association, it just came time where they felt they had to deal with this. They had to make some kind of decision about how to publicly address an issue, given that their constituency is children of all races, religions, genders, etc. And so I have a lot of sympathy for that, and I think they did what they felt they had to do, and I don't really have a problem with that. I have a problem with censorship, which is a different issue. I don't think censorship is ever a good idea, and neither does the American Library Association. They are very vocal about. So they came out with a statement and urged everybody to keep reading Laura Ingalls Wilder. But there is I think we do have to grapple with, do you teach these books to very young children in the way that they used to be taught? I don't think you can anymore, not in the way that they used to be taught. How you do it, I don't know. I'm not a teacher, I'm not a librarian, but I do think we'd have to have a conversation about it. So I kind of welcome the issue coming up.
Not too far from here is the town of
Iowa, where the Braille and Sight Saving School is located, and there's a long... We can't hear you.
The Braille and Sight Saving School in Vinton, and there's a long history about her sister Mary, who was blind, and her
going to the school
when she was a younger child and being there for like 8 years. They do pageants up in Vinton every year on that, and it's quite a huge event. Did the impact of her sister Mary affect Laura Ingalls, do you think?
Oh, definitely. I mean, I think it's really apparent that part of why Laura became such an excellent observer of human behavior and also just a really talented writer of description is in part because she did have to work with Mary, explaining what she was seeing, telling her where they were going and what she saw, and really serving as kind of Mary's handmaiden in that very difficult period after Mary lost her sight. So yes, I do think that what happened to Mary was fairly crucial in Laura's developing those skills.
Yes, I know that you are a scholar rather than an educator of children. So, but maybe you can address this nonetheless. When I was exposed in school to the Little House books when I was 7 years old, I understood that Ma hated Indians because she had this particular frame of reference, and it wasn't necessarily a good idea to hate Indians, but still it was explained why Ma hated Indians. Similarly, at that same age, I read the Tom Sawyer, Huckleberry Finn. I was aware that slavery was wrong and that certain words were socially unacceptable today, and I just took those books as a product of their time and place and took them with the appropriate grain of salt. Now, why is it that in those days we trusted kids to take that attitude, and today apparently we don't?
Well, yeah, that's, it's an issue, but I also would suggest that in states that have a significant Native American population, I live in, for example, in New Mexico, which has multiple tribes and the Navajo reservation, and it's a different environment when you're teaching in those states as opposed to some states which have very little Native American presence. So of course I don't think it's so much an issue of saying, oh, kids are too stupid to understand what they're reading or anything like that. But I do think it represents a real problem for teachers who are teaching to children, because it's really hard to tell a 10-year-old, to engage in the kind of literary analysis that I just presented in terms of, as something as serious as, that infamous slur in Little House on the Prairie. How do you create a situation where you're reading something like that, and it then doesn't become sort of weaponized, by other children? So, again, I can't really offer any advice or explain how you deal with those problematic texts, but it's a completely different thing to deal with those texts for children than it is for adults. I mean, on the university level, for example, I think you should have to read everything. If that's what you're doing is studying literature, then you have to study literature. And everything, virtually from the 19th century and the 20th century and before, is all problematic in one way or the other. But again, when you're talking about kids of younger years, then that is a different question.
My question for you, just on the craft of writing biography, about your research time, writing time, editing time. What does a day look like as you write?
Well, there are different phases, because there were, the times when early on, I went to all the little houses, and I came here to the Herbert Hoover. I was given a travel grant by the Hoover Foundation to come here and spend an extra week, which was wonderful. And that process is, its own kind of phase where you're kind of seeing where somebody lived and experiencing the landscape and looking at, because each of the houses has a different kind of set of things to offer. I mean, some of them are reproductions of the houses, like the one in Kansas. Others, like in Malone, New York, the actual farmhouse that Almanzo Wilder grew up in is still there. So you can really experience a little bit of what that family, where that family lived and how they lived. And there are different sort of archival things at each of these places, different things that have been saved, marvelous things in DeSmet, South Dakota. So that's a very different part of the process than actually sitting down to write, which is very not very dramatic. And that, I mean, my husband and I are always joking about how writers are portrayed in movies because they have to somehow come up with some dramatic image of somebody ripping the page out of a typewriter and crumpling it up, and there's not a lot of that going on. But yeah, I mean, it's just kind of sitting there and doing the job, and as you go along, you suddenly come up against questions that you didn't adequately answer yet, and so those questions then have to be resolved. So the research is kind of the fun part, and the writing is work.
I had one question about a specific scene that you were talking about. It was a wonderful book, and the depth and context that you brought to everything, but the most emotionally impactful for me was the few pages that you wrote about the death of Charles Ingalls, which I, of course, having read the book or watched all the documentaries or other things, I hadn't actually processed the fact that Pa would die at some point. And I was just wondering, you seem to bring more poetry and impact that scene more emotionally. I wasn't sure if that was me or if you had to, how you dealt with that scene where you came to the death, and even talking about that gift of literary immortality that Laura had bestowed upon her husband, or upon her father, who otherwise would probably not be remembered in American history.
Right. Yeah, I mean, that seemed to me absolutely crucial. I think the deaths of both of her parents were crucial in her decision to write. Her mother's death later, I think, really was a wake-up call. She realized, I'm running out of time. If I'm ever going to do this, I have to do it now. But the death of her father, I think, was probably the most wrenching experience of her life. And in the aftermath of it, we don't know exactly when, but she wrote this extraordinary kind of fragment. We don't know what it was part of, or if it was part of anything, but it was a memory of him. And that's when she really emerges as a writer. That's just an extraordinary piece of writing, and I think that it was that relationship, her relationship to her father, who was taken away from her, not just by death, but by the fact that the Wilders had really failed at farming and had to leave to find another place to farm that was easier for Almanzo after his stroke. And so that to me was one of the most crucial moments of her life, when her yearning for her father to kind of recapture that relationship, must have evolved from that. Obviously, I'm to some extent, I'm putting this on that scene retrospectively, but given what she wrote about it, it seemed justified.
One more question. Any takers? Okay. Looks like we're done.
Okay.
Thank you for coming.